Hi everyone, welcome back to Higher Biology. Today we are continuing on with Unit 3, Sustainability and Interdependence, and we're moving on to Key Area 3, which is crop protection. So this key area is pretty self-explanatory. We've looked before at why we need to grow crops and how we can grow crops. Today we're going to be looking at how you actually protect those crops through some different means. And a lot of this will be a little bit of a reminder of National 5. If you don't remember anything about that, don't worry, we cover it anyway. So let's get started with this just now. So first of all, you might know that weeds are a pretty negative thing. You don't want them growing, say, in your garden. You certainly don't want them growing in your fields where you grow your crops. Now, in terms of agriculture, these can have a significant economic impact. So remember, we're looking at how we need to grow more food to feed an increasingly larger population across the world. We do not want weeds, and they're going to cause that impact. Now, the impacts here could be that they cause a reduction in the productivity of the crop plant due to competition. So we've looked beforehand at competition caused by weeds, because the weeds will grow, they challenge the crop plant for both light, nutrient, space. So competition can have that reduction of crop productivity. Weeds can also release chemical inhibitors into the soil, which further reduces the crop plants that you have available. So effectively they could be poisoning them. Some of these weeds are actually very good at releasing certain inhibitors into the soil to stunt the growth of plants that they're trying to compete with. The other things that weeds can do is they can contaminate any grain crops that you have with the weed's seeds. If you could do that, then you reduce the crop's value as well and economic impact. And the main thing that we really look at, and what this key area is going to focus on, is acting as a host for pests and diseases. So if you have too many weeds, yes, they can cause contamination, they can release chemicals, they're very bad at competing with crops, but they can act as a host for certain pests and disease which you don't want anywhere near your crop. So first of all, before we go into protecting these crops, we want to look at two different types of weed. Now you'll come across some different names in older textbooks and stuff. The names have been changed quite apart. What we look at now are annual weeds and perennial weeds. Now, annual weeds complete their entire life cycle, so that's from growing from a seed to getting to reproductive age and then dying, all in 1 year. So you think of annual just means a year. Annual weeds complete their life cycle in 1 year. However, perennial weeds are slightly different. They can live for several years, and instead of dying out, they can just become dormant in the winter and regrow again in the spring. Now, both of these types of weed have different properties that you need to be aware of. You could be told some information about a weed and asked which form of weed is it, annual or perennial. So in terms of annual weeds, first of all, again, they complete their life cycle in 1 year. If they complete their life cycle in 1 year, you tend to find that their life strategy is very fast. They want to grow quickly, they want to reproduce as quickly as possible, they want to produce as many seeds as they can, basically before they die. It's all very fast-lived. So the properties of an annual weed is that they produce vast numbers of seeds, so large numbers of seeds, to try and increase the chances of offspring as much as possible. These seeds are also viable for long periods of time, and viable means that they can live, they can work, they're not just going to die out after 24 hours. These seeds can be left lying around until they have the chance to grow. If they grow very quickly, again, to get to that stage where they can also reproduce and produce all these seeds. And they also have a short life cycle because it only takes place within that 1 year. Again, growing from a seed, growing to reproductive age, dispersing your seeds, and then dying off. So those are the standard things you'd expect with an annual weed. You may have seen some of these before if you're taking a walk, particularly like the annual meadowgrass is your standard sort of grassy weed you can see if you go through a field. They've often got these characteristics of being able to scatter lots of seeds as quickly as possible and covering a wide area. And chickweed and wood sorrel are again ones you may see. These are all very short-lived. They last 1 year. They produce large amounts of seeds, and they grow very quickly. So the second type are perennials. So as I said, perennials live for several years, they become dormant in the winter, and then they can pop up again in the spring. So they're a bit trickier to deal with as well from a crop protection point of view. So the properties that they have is they can reproduce asexually. If they reproduce asexually, then they can spread quite well as well. Because of this, you'll find that they are already established within their habitat, and they have storage organs that provide food during poor conditions. So these storage organs are basically underneath the plant, they're sort of beside the roots. That provides food when it gets to, say, winter, where it goes into a state of dormancy, like we discussed in Unit 2 in terms of animals. Those storage organs are there to provide energy for the plant so it can grow again in the spring. So if you want to kill off these weeds, you need to make sure you don't just remove the flowers, the stem, you need to get rid of the roots and the storage organs as well. And we're going to touch on that later on. Again, there might be some examples here, particularly things like dandelions, buttercups and brambles that you'll have noticed before. These are seen as being weeds. They can have negative impacts on agriculture, so people want to get rid of them. But these perennial weeds will all have underground storage in order to help them, and if they die out, if they become dormant in the winter, they will grow again in the spring. So we mentioned earlier on that these weeds can also have a hand in allowing pests to get to your crops, and this is another part we're going to talk about. So again, we're going to go and split this all up into different types of pests, and these are the main ones we can come across. We can either come across nematodes, which are basically extremely small worms that you'd find in the soil that can cause a lot of problems for your crops. There are mollusks, which would be your snails or slugs, and anyone who has a garden will be able to tell you that if a slug gets to your lettuce plants, for example, then the plant is going to get decimated pretty quickly. The final one we're going to look at as well, though, are insect pests. Now, these can be things like butterflies or aphids. I'll talk about greenfly aphids a few times as well. These are also issues that can get onto your crops. They can either eat the crops themselves or they can spread some disease, which is also a negative thing. Now, the effect of some of these invertebrate pests is that they can destroy the leaves. Now, if they destroy the leaves of a plant, not only is that annoying for you trying to grow these crops, but the effect on a plant is pretty substantial. This is because if you destroy the leaves, then you reduce the plant's ability to carry out photosynthesis. So we looked at photosynthesis in key area 3.1, and obviously you need your leaves to capture that light energy and then to produce glucose and other products for your plant. If you don't have leaves, or if your leaves have been damaged, you're not going to be able to carry out photosynthesis. This is then going to have a reduction in vigour and yield. Effectively, you can't make as much energy, so your plant is not going to grow as much, which is a huge effect. The other thing that pests can do is they can be something that we call a vector for other diseases. Now, if you remember, we talked about vectors during the genetic control of metabolism, where we looked at a vector being able to pass genetic information into a new organism. A vector just means really something that can transport something. Now, a vector in this case is an insect that can or a pest that can pass on disease. So these pests that are trying to eat your crops can also bring some diseases into your crops that we'll look at as well, that can make your corn look something like this, which you do not want. In terms of these diseases, they are caused by certain pathogens. Now, pathogens we've discussed before are any form of disease-causing organism. So things like bacteria, fungi have quite a big effect on crops, but also viruses. Viruses don't just affect animals, they can affect plants as well. So these can all be spread through the air, the soil, or through these invertebrate vectors that we discussed. So for example, an aphid that is eating your plants, it might not be wanting to, but it has also passed on some sort of bacterial infection or a virus that can then lead to plant diseases. If you have a plant disease, then your yield is going to decrease because of the negative impact onto the plant. Now, in terms of how we can try and counteract some of these things, it's clear we want to make sure we don't have any weeds around our crops. So for the next little while, we're going to talk about two different ways of getting through your protection. Now, the first type is a cultural means. Now, a cultural means just means that it's a non-chemical method. So it doesn't use anything like pesticides that we've discussed before in National 5. And we'll look at some examples there. The second form, though, chemical means, are when you use chemical methods. And this is really the use of pesticides, especially when cultural means are not doing a good enough job. So in terms of these cultural methods, we've been using these for a long period of time. As long as people have been wanting to try and grow crops, they've been looking at ways to try and keep them healthier and increase the yield. So any form of cultural method is a method of controlling weeds without using chemicals. And there's three main ones that we're going to discuss. The first one is ploughing, or turning over the soil. Now, ploughing can be good for a number of reasons for your crops or for your soil, but in terms of crop protection, it can be a good way of getting rid of weeds. The reason for this is if weeds are growing on your crops, you can go and plough through the field, usually taking off about the top 20 centimetres of soil, and as that field is ploughed, those weeds will then be buried under the soil. If the weeds are buried under the soil, then they're going to die because they can't survive underground, and they're going to die and they're going to decompose. So it's a quick way of getting rid of a lot of those weeds just by turning over the soil. The other method, which is a bit more labour intensive, is manually just getting in there and pulling out those weeds. So just weeding. Removing weeds needs to be done early in the crop's life. So like we just saw there with ploughing, you want to plough the field before you grow your crops, and you've got rid of the weeds. Same with actually weeding. You don't want established weeds growing when you're trying to grow a crop plant. If a seedling is starting to come out of the soil, but there's already weeds there that they're competing with, then the weeds are going to outcompete your crops, which can lead to a decrease in yield or just your plants dying. You need to make sure that you weed your crops or your area where you're going to grow crops before you actually have your crops growing substantially. But you also need to make sure that you remove any weeds from the edges of the fields as well. So not just the area that you're physically growing crops in, but the surrounding area also. This is because they can provide a breeding ground for pathogens, so like these vectors for disease that we've discussed beforehand. Finally, there's something called crop rotation. Now, crop rotation is a series of different crops grown in a rotation over the same piece of ground. So imagine if you have 4 fields like we're just seeing in the diagram here just now. If you grew potatoes in one, cabbages in the other, peas, which we'll come on to in another, and also onions. What you can do there is, first of all, in terms of increasing the usability of that soil, is the potatoes that you grow will take in certain nutrients. If you grow potatoes in that field every single year, they are going to use up all those nutrients and you're not going to get a good yield. However, if you go and rotate your crops and it moves into the cabbage field, for example, and the onions move into the potato field, the onions are going to take up slightly different nutrients from the potatoes. And this just makes the whole process of growing a bit more sustainable. However, in terms of crop protection, the good reason for using crop rotation is that any pathogens in the soil from the first crop will not be able to then grow into the second crop. You're rotating them, you're moving them around. So for example, if there is a potato pathogen and it becomes established in the soil, it is not going to grow again that next year in the same field and affect the potatoes. So it's a good method, again a cultural method, of trying to avoid any damage to your crops. Now, you may have noticed in the diagram there I had peas which were nitrogen fixing. Now, if you are going to rotate your crops, like I said, it's really useful for the nutrient levels in your soil. A good way of adding to the nutrient levels of the soil, which you might remember from National 5, is growing any leguminous or nitrogen fixing plants. So things like clover, for example, are something you can grow on an area of ground to add nitrogen to the soil. But in terms of things like peas and beans, these legumes that we talk about, they also produce a high amount of nitrogen. So that can add nutrients to the soil to stop it all being depleted. And that leads to a more sustainable method as well of crop rotation. Okay, so we've had a look at the cultural versions of maintaining your crops and protecting them from any sort of pests, weeds and disease. We're now going to look at the chemical types. So chemicals can be used to control pests, especially if your cultural means are not doing a good enough job. And these are called pesticides, which you may have heard of before. Luckily, the names for these are fairly self-explanatory. So pesticides kill all types of pests. Herbicides kill plants. Fungicides kill fungus. Insecticides kill insects. Molluscicides kill mollusks. And nematicides go and destroy any nematodes you have living in your soil. All fairly self-explanatory. We're really just going to focus on herbicides, but I'll give you a little mention about fungicides as well, along with how pesticides actually work in general. So again, this is broken down even further. There are two different types of herbicide that you can use. They can be selective or they can be systemic. So we'll go into more detail here, but effectively, selective plants, or selective herbicides rather, mimic the action of plant growth hormones. So they work in quite a specific way. And you would use this on selected plants. Usually you'd be able to use them on broadleaf plants. They're not good at working with narrow-leaf plants, such as cereals. Systemic plants, though, are a bit more effective, but they're a bit more destructive as well. They spread through the vascular system of a plant, so the full transport system. They can be used on any of these plants, and they destroy the whole plant. We'll have a look at how this works just in a second, but we'll move on to selective herbicides just now. So you may have noticed before, if you're trying to get rid of weeds or if people are getting rid of certain types of weed, you can go and spray weed killer, which is a herbicide, on selected weeds. So for example, this person's spraying, I believe, dandelions on an area of grass. The way a selective herbicide works then is it mimics the action of plant growth hormones. So just like in humans or in animals, plants have growth hormones that are able to create normal levels of growth in the plant. Now, if you went and used one of these herbicides, which mimics the action of these plant growth hormones, this would speed up the metabolism of these broadleaf plants. And it speeds them up to an extent that they try and grow very, very quickly, they use up all their energy, they then use up all their food reserves, and they die out. So it's quite an effective way of killing a weed. However, like I said, this has no effect on narrow-leaf plants, such as your cereal crops or your grasses or such. So they're to be used on selected types of weed. Systemic herbicides, though, they get added to the soil. So you can spray them or add them to the soil. The plant then absorbs them through the roots, and the herbicide then goes all the way through the plant. So it goes through the vascular system, the transport system of the plant, and destroys the entire plant, including the root. Now bear in mind we talked earlier about perennials and how you have these storage organs to allow regrowth. You want to kill that off if you're trying to destroy that weed and stop it coming back. If you just ripped out part of the weed or cut off the top, they have that storage unit, which means the plant is going to grow back. If you use a systemic herbicide though, it kills off the storage organs and prevents any regrowth from taking place. So if you were being asked a question about why would you use a systemic herbicide on a plant or a weed rather, then you can say you'd use a systemic herbicide in order to destroy the whole plant and make sure there's no regrowth or it's going to come back. You may have seen before in certain adverts on TV that you can use certain types of weed killer that destroy the root, because that is one of the big things with weeds. You can kill the plant, but that might not be effective. You want to kill the whole thing in order to stop it coming back. Now in this diagram as well, you might notice that there's a little image on the right hand side of an insect that's taken a munch out of a leaf and has fallen to its doom afterwards. So in terms of pesticides on the whole, so these pesticides that kill any forms of insects or pests, they can also be systemic in their nature. If they are, how it works is that you add the systemic pesticide to the soil. Again, it's absorbed by the plant, but remember this is not a herbicide. It's not actually going to negatively affect the plant. All that happens is the plant effectively becomes poisonous, and any pest that comes across and takes a bite out of that plant, out of the leaf for example, is going to be affected by that pesticide and is going to die. So just trying to remember that with systemic pesticides, it is absorbed by the plant, moves through the whole plant. If it's a herbicide, it destroys the whole plant. If it's another form of pesticide, then it just means that plant is now poisoned. So we've talked quite a bit there about pesticides. And one of the things we need to be aware of is what would be the ideal characteristics of a pesticide. If we're going to use them, what should they be like? So first of all, they should be specific to the pest concerned. You shouldn't be using a pesticide that will just kill any insect or any living thing in the area. That's a pretty bad idea. If you have a greenfly infestation, you want to have a pesticide that would only affect greenfly. The other thing is that they should have a short life. Now this term here, they should not persist in the environment. Basically, they should not last. You should not spray an area with a pesticide or any form of chemical which lingers around for seasons or years. Ideally as well, it will break down into harmless products and therefore not affect the soil in coming years. And finally, it should be safe for both humans and animals. So it should be safe for us is ideal, but also if you have a farm, you don't want any livestock being negatively affected by a pesticide that you have put on your crops. So these are the ideal things you would look for in a pesticide. Then before we go any further, I said there would be one little thing we talk about with fungicides. The reason we bring this up is that in terms of using pesticides to kill off any form of pest, fungicides tend to be applied before there's a fungal issue. The reason for this is it is much more effective to apply fungicides before there's a problem rather than treating it once the crop is diseased. If your crop is diseased with fungus, it means that it's already quite far gone, to be honest. It's going to be very hard to treat it. Instead, you can look at disease forecasts. You can see if people are predicting a certain fungus to become quite widespread in your country or in your area. Sometimes as well, it can be environmental concerns such as moisture levels, or it's been a very damp or humid year, so the chances of getting a certain type of fungus are higher. If you know that forecast is coming up, then you should be using fungicides before you have a fungal issue appearing in your crops. And now, moving on to the end really of pesticides, we've talked about different types of pesticides, how they work, and what would be the ideal forms of pesticides. However, we're now going to talk about problems with pesticides as well, and this is something that gets talked about quite a lot. So one of the problems we can have is they may be toxic to non-target species. So kind of the opposite of what we said would be ideal. You could be using a pesticide which also wipes out species that you were not trying to target. And this can be incredibly negative and also wipe out some non-target species in the area. Secondly, we said that we do not want them to persist or stay in the environment. There are some pesticides that may persist in the environment. They may also produce a resistant population of pests. And this is an issue almost like antibiotics. Overuse of antibiotics has led to some bacteria being resistant. And we now have a problem because we can't treat them with the standard antibiotics that we wanted to use. Pesticides are exactly the same. If you go and use these pesticides, they may end up producing a population of pests that are resistant to that pesticide. What can then happen is you have to produce a new type of pesticide, which might be stronger, it might be more toxic to everything else, it might persist in the environment. You're now trying to battle this resistant population. And the final point that we're going to have a look at here is bioaccumulation. So we're going to look at how the use of pesticides can either lead to bioaccumulation or something called biomagnification. Now this is something you might have came across before, and you might think that both these terms actually mean the same thing, but they don't, and we're going to look at how that is an issue just now. So first of all, with bioaccumulation, there are many plant protection chemicals, such as pesticides in general, that have been found to, again, persist or stay in the environment. But this build-up of this pesticide in an organism is called bioaccumulation. So if there was an animal, for example, that was ingesting small amounts of a pesticide, but they're ingesting those small amounts of a pesticide several times a day, over time that leads to the accumulation of this toxin in an organism, which could become very, very toxic and harmful to the organism, even resulting in death. This build-up or this accumulation of a toxin is simply called bioaccumulation. But what you need to remember is bioaccumulation takes place in one organism. It is not through a food chain, it is only one organism. So as I've just hinted at there, the increase in the concentration of a chemical or a toxin moving between these different trophic levels is called biomagnification. So you can have something right at the bottom of, say, a food chain or a food web or a pyramid that is starting to accumulate in certain forms of toxin. However, if something else is then eating that organism, then that starts to move its way through these trophic levels. So they've got a diagram here. For example, there's often been scares about the level of mercury in tuna. If you have the smaller level like the krill that take in this mercury that's leached into the water, they can accumulate some mercury. However, your primary consumer, such as your salmon or pollock or oyster, can then come across and eat lots of krill. Once they eat lots of krill that all have trace amounts of mercury, there's going to be a build-up of mercury in that primary consumer. But then that will pass on to the secondary consumer that will be eating lots of the primary consumers. And so on and so forth. This can then move through these trophic levels or through this food chain. So you end up with this accumulation of a toxin moving all the way through these trophic levels. And in this case, it is called biomagnification. So bioaccumulation is in one organism. Biomagnification is through trophic levels. So finally, everyone, we're going to talk about biological control. So we've looked at the cultural means of protecting your crops, and we've looked at chemical means and the advantages and disadvantages of them. We're just going to finish up here with a part that you may remember from National 5 called biological control, which is the use of a predator, a parasite, or a pathogen. You could really term it as the natural enemies almost of a pest, and you use that to control pest numbers. So for example, you could introduce a natural predator to the pest that's going to go across and eat them. You could introduce a parasite that's going to target the pest, or you could even introduce a pathogen, so bringing in a disease that's going to affect that pest. And that's more of a controversial one, but we'll look at some examples of all of these here. So first of all, using a predator. The common example we talk about here is ladybirds love to eat aphids. So therefore, if you have aphids eating all of your crops, then rather than using chemicals, or perhaps on top of using chemicals to get the numbers down, which we'll look at, you can instead use ladybirds as a predator. So the use of this predator here, like release the ladybirds, means that ladybirds are going to go over your crop, they're going to find these aphids and they are going to eat them. And by eating those ladybirds, then it's going to have a reduction in pest numbers, which means there's going to be less of a negative effect on your plant. Next, in terms of parasites, you can use certain parasites like this Incarcia parasitic wasp, which likes to basically hunt down whitefly and lay its eggs inside them. If it lays its eggs inside the whitefly, it then destroys the whitefly. So again, if you have whitefly, which is having a negative effect on your crop, then what you might want to do is go and bring in these parasitic wasps, which are going to use this whitefly as a host for its eggs, and in doing so, kill them off. Still a form of biological control. And finally, pathogens. So being able to introduce any sort of disease or disease-causing organism to these pests is another way of wiping them out. So there's an example here of a bacteria which is able to infect caterpillars with Bt toxin, which is what we talked about in the previous key area where we looked at effectively a natural pesticide. So if you're able to use this bacteria or introduce this bacteria in some way to your crops where caterpillars were eating all of your crops, then this pathogen would then go wipe out the caterpillars. So all of these are still biological, natural ways of reducing pest numbers, which all work and can have a good impact on your crop yield. However, there is a risk with them. You want to make sure that you use any form of biological control in a controlled environment. Ideally something like a greenhouse or some sort of enclosure where you can make sure that they are not going to escape into a wider area. If they do go into a wider area, particularly an area that's free from any sort of predators or parasites or pathogens that can affect them, then what can happen is the numbers of this biological control can grow exponentially. They can start going absolutely crazy and affect the local population. And a common example of this is cane toads in Australia. This is one you can go and research yourself, which was effectively a method of biological control for sugarcane plantations in Puerto Rico, was using cane toads. So someone decided that because their sugarcane plantations were being eaten up by certain grubs and beetles in Australia, they instead decided to bring in some cane toads from Puerto Rico. Now, the use of this then led to cane toads becoming an invasive species. What's now happened is, I believe there was about 100 cane toads that were introduced into Australia. There are now hundreds of millions of cane toads because they got into the environment. They are incredibly toxic to the animals in Australia, so there's no natural predator of cane toads. Because of that, they have now increased massively in number, which has had a massively negative effect on the natural environment. So you have to be careful that biological controls are contained. The final part here then, just this last slide, is talking about the use of all of these. What is the ideal way to protect your crops? How it is this method of integrated pest management, which is a combination of chemical control, cultural control, and biological control. The aim of this is to reduce the chemical use, so using pesticides only when you absolutely have to, and reduce your pests to a level where biological control is able to take over. And that is seen as the sort of happy medium between all of those, not relying too much on chemicals, but then getting to a level where you can use biological control and cultural control. And that is it for this key area. This has been quite a lot to cover. Hopefully you're feeling okay with a lot of it, but just make sure you go back, you look at the differences between annual and perennial weeds, and also take a look at different ways of controlling these types of weeds. Why would you use a selective or a systemic herbicide, for example? Then you can talk about biological control and what's the issues with that, along with any issues of using pesticides. I hope you found these useful. Thanks again for all the comments that you've had coming my way. We're working our way through Unit 3 now, and I'll get the next video up very soon. Thanks so much for listening, everyone, and I'll speak to you soon with Key Area 4, and catch you later.